You can see that night, a heavy rainstorm, and she's driving.
A deadly accident in a tropical paradise, and a mystery.
There appeared to be a figure covered with a blanket.
That's the place. We found some trace evidence.
A call for a unique forensic mind. And half a world away, in an exclusive Connecticut neighborhood.
This portion of the break, direct contact with a human head.
A celebration and a deadly aftermath.
It was a very complex, baffling crime scene.
We followed the blood smear along this driveway.
Another mysterious trail of evidence tests the forensic mind of Dr. Henry Lee. On a busy day at his forensic lab in Connecticut, Dr. Henry Lee received a set of crime scene photos, postmarked Hawaii. What caught his eye was an unusual pattern of bloodstains at the scene of an accident near Hilo, a sleepy town on the rainy side of the Big Island of Hawaii. One stormy night in November, on the slopes of Kilauea, the most active volcano in the world, Officer Richard Sherlock responded to reports of a one-car accident.
A police officer who, at that time of the night, sees a car driven off the side of the road usually believes that there's alcohol involved.
But when the officer looked inside the van, he could see this was no ordinary DUI.
I saw a male party. There appeared to be a figure covered with a blanket laying on his lap. I looked at him and I said, "Is she okay?" And he kind of pulled the blanket down, and there was a large wound to the chin of the female party. It didn't look good at all.
The officer recognized Sergeant Ken Matheson, a 14-year veteran of the force with a construction business on the side. Matheson appeared to be in shock when he told the officer that he and his wife, Yvonne, had planned to spend the night out, but then everything went wrong.
I was letting him speak, tell me what happened. They had gotten into an argument and she had jumped out of the car. He had turned around to find her.
Matheson explained how his van hit something. That's when he realized he had accidentally run over his wife. He carried her into the back of the van and held her in his arms.
He told me she had looked at him and said, "I love you." And then he had told her, "I love you too." And he believes at that time, that's when she died.
The police took their colleague and friend at his word. Yvonne's death was listed as a negligent homicide in the 3rd degree, a misdemeanor. But not everyone believed the police report.
The family felt kind of shocked in the beginning when we found out that it was classified as a negligent homicide, because we felt that they didn't investigate it enough. The reason for her being out there on the road, the reason for her being run over, and just everything Ken said didn't tie in. But the police department didn't seem to be putting a whole lot of effort into it.
Yvonne Matheson's death touched a nerve. A number of suspicious cases on the Big Island had gone unsolved. Angry residents took to the streets, hoping to put pressure on the police to get to the bottom of this case.
The first press release from the police department never mentioned who was driving the car that hit her. It just said that Yvonne Matheson had been, in this fatal traffic accident, had been hit on the side of the road. And it wasn't until another reporter went and looked at the traffic accident report and saw who the driver of the car was that, the news media brought it out before the police did. And so that immediately got the public thinking cover up.
But even the officer assigned to the investigation had questions about what happened on that rainy November night.
The questions that ran into my mind immediately was, where was the physical evidence on the outside of the van? Where is the physical evidence on the roadway that I'm accustomed to seeing in a pedestrian motor vehicle incident?
Investigators didn't know whether to believe Sergeant Matheson's accident story and decided to ask Dr. Henry Lee for help. Based in Connecticut, 5,000 miles away, Dr. Lee is in demand around the globe to solve particularly difficult cases. At first, he said he was too busy. But when he saw the crime scene photos and learned a police officer was involved, he changed his mind and flew to Hawaii.
My heart feels more and more heavier. I was a police officer before. I love my fellow officers. I love law enforcement. But this case, we have to look at the fact. Nothing more than the fact.
But some of the most important facts were going to be hard to find. Investigators discovered Yvonne Matheson's body had been cremated, adding to suspicions that her death was no accident.
The family was so surprised to hear that Yvonne was cremated, because we know that she had no desire to be cremated.
And I said, cremated? By whose order? He said, well, by Ken Matheson's order.
Without a body, the van was the only surviving piece of evidence in the case. But it turned out the police didn't have the van either. It had been returned to none other than its owner, Ken Matheson.
I was pretty upset because, you figure very often in a murder case, the best evidence that you have is the body. And the body had been cremated. And the crime scene in this case was the van. And if the van was gone and the body was gone, we would have a real problem showing what happened in this case.
Was Yvonne Matheson the victim of a tragic accident or a premeditated murder? With no body and a missing crime scene, solving this mystery would be one of Dr. Lee's greatest challenges. Hilo, Hawaii Sergeant Ken Matheson told the police he accidentally ran over his wife with the family van. But investigators were suspicious, and they called in renowned forensic expert Henry Lee. His first stop on the Big Island, the scene of the accident.
Usually when we go to a crime scene, look at the body, look at the crime scene, you have to try to relive what did happen. Yvonne Matheson is talking to me, but it's not verbally talk to me. It's through the crime scene. When you close your eyes, you can see that night, a heavy rainstorm, and she's driving. You can hear they argue. You can hear one thing lead to another, result this tragedy. Let me tell you a story. Last time I was here, and we walked to the police station. There's no coffee and no donut. The more we dig into, the more evidence we found. They changed their mind. The sergeant went out, bought a donut and Boston cream. That's my favorite.
Your favorite?
When Dr. Lee returned to Hilo with Major Timothy Palmbach, who has worked with him for 25 years and now heads Connecticut's forensic lab, he told Palmbach about the stroke of luck that changed the course of the investigation. Ken Matheson reportedly thought the $300 impound charge to reclaim his van was too steep and never picked it up. Today, the van is at the Hilo police station, and Lee showed Palmbach what he found. They began as they usually do, examining the exterior of the vehicle.
According to Sergeant Matheson's statement, he accidentally ran over Yvonne.
But isn't this a difficult...
It was what Henry Lee didn't find that told him Yvonne Matheson wasn't hit by the van while she was standing.
There's no damage. When we examined the exterior of the vehicle, no hair, no tissue, no fabric impression, no damage of the vehicle was found. The negative evidence shows that's impossible to happen.
But could Yvonne Matheson have slipped and fallen on the rain-soaked highway before she was run over?
You're getting too fat.
Oh, no, I'll have to start drinking light beer, I guess.
Yeah. That's the place we found some fresh scraping mark. Okay. In addition, I found some trace evidence, tissue, hair.
On the undercarriage of the van, Henry Lee used a monochromatic base light source to look for physiological materials barely visible to the naked eye.
Like material, also.
He took samples of the brownish material and confirmed it was blood.
We took to the laboratory, shows that's human blood. Blood typing indicates that's Yvonne's blood type, which indicative this portion have contact her.
Taken alone, this evidence might let Matheson off the hook. But when Dr. Lee looked inside the van, he could see the case was far from closed.
As soon as you get into the driver's area, you get some blood staining that was very unique and very distinctive, and almost instantly brought Dr. Lee to the conclusion that something significant happened here.
We can go back, study the stand, determine the cause of origin, then reconstruct what did happen, how did it happen, what the sequence event.
Henry Lee demonstrates there was a 30-inch blood drip on a side panel in the front of the van. There were blood smears and drops on the door and blood spatter on the driver's side window.
Medium, of course, on the roof area, we have this large amount of smear with hair pattern, shows the movement.
It was the swipe pattern that interested Dr. Lee the most. There was similar movement in the stain on the sun visor, which he believed was also caused by Yvonne Matheson's hair soaked in blood, possibly during a struggle.
Through a careful analysis, you can see where the contact originates, and then you can watch it progress and move, and you could see that movement essentially from left to right or from the outer part of the car.
In the back of the van, there was some cast-off spatter on the ceiling. But the evidence that had really stumped investigators was 100 blood drops on the instrument panel and middle console. If Ken Matheson had put his injured wife in the back of the van, as he claimed, how did her blood get into the driver's compartment?
I couldn't see how this fine spatter would get on the instrument panel. The back of the van is like this, and there's a seat like that where the driver's seat is, and I couldn't see how blood could arc over the driver's seat and get onto the instrument panels.
This is a medium velocity impact blood spatter. We look at the size. It's a range from 5 millimeter to 1 millimeter in size. On the instrumental panel, have a similar pattern.
The size and shape of each blood drop told Henry Lee a great deal about what happened that night. He found the exact angle each drop had hit the surface using a trigonometric calculation, then used string to traject back to where the blood had originated. The evidence suggested Yvonne Matheson was in the driver's seat, not in the back cargo area as her husband had claimed. Even more significant, the pattern of the blood drops on the dashboard told Dr. Lee that she might have been struck 4 times.
What Dr. Lee clearly saw was the directionalities, the distribution of these droplets were not in one direction. In other words, they were elongated, and their placement and distribution spoke to him and said, this is not a one-time event. There is more than one origin point here.
Henry Lee believed the forensic evidence raised serious questions about Sergeant Matheson's story. While he worked on finding the answers, investigators learned about a phone call Yvonne Matheson made to the Big Island Crisis Center the week before she died.
She said that she wouldn't be alive by Christmas. And I asked her, what did that mean? Wondering if it was, going to be a suicide call. And she said her husband had told her that he was going to murder her. And he told her how he was going to do it, when he was going to do it, where he was going to do it, and how he was going to get away with it.
The woman said her name was Yvonne Matheson, and she refused any help.
Finally, I just gave up. And I said, what is it that you want? And she said, I want you to speak for me when I'm dead.
Yvonne Matheson's haunting request did not come as a complete shock to her family.
You'd see the bruises, and a few times I've addressed her with it, and she'd say that, she got banged into a wall, or she walked through the door and hit the door. You want to believe her, but, in the back of your mind, because she was so unhappy, it kind of made you think, there must be something else going on.
But the biggest break came when investigators dug up life insurance policies that Ken Matheson had recently taken out. His wife's payout would double in size if she died in an auto accident.
That is when I knew we had a murder here, because we had the motive, and we knew that there was a violent struggle in this van, and nothing in Ken Matheson's story would explain that violent struggle.
We have to many times relive with the whole case. It's a big burden to us to relive. You have to feel what the physical evidence lead to us. But forget about human factor. The voice is through the physical evidence.
Ken Matheson claimed to have a simple explanation for how his wife's blood got into the front of the van. Would the physical evidence Henry Lee collected be enough to make a case against him? After analyzing the forensic evidence in Ken Matheson's van, Henry Lee concluded that Yvonne Matheson's tragic death on a Hawaiian highway was no accident. Once Dr. Lee submitted his findings to the Hilo police, Matheson was arrested and charged with murder. But at the trial, the defense attempted to explain everything that had happened that rainy night, including what supposedly led his wife to jump out of the van.
He had something he wanted to talk to her about, something rather unpleasant involving an anticipated lawsuit that was going to be filed naming him as in a paternity case. His version of the facts is that when he brought the matter up to Yvonne, she took it very badly, became quite hysterical.
And how would Matheson explain why there was so much blood in the front of the van? He said it was simple. He had carried his bloody wife into the driver's seat first.
He picked her up, physically carried her to get her into the front of the car to drive her down the road to the hospital. The hospital was 20 minutes away, more or less. And so that is why he carried her initially into the front seat. And it's in the front seat that you find this great deal of blood. And when that failed and he couldn't get her out, he then took her into the back to lay her down. And it was in a state of extreme emotion, as you can imagine, when the police arrived.
But for Henry Lee, it didn't add up.
If he say he found the body brought back to the van, now we can see some contact pattern. That's we can explain. Maybe he carried his wife's body too high, so her head touched the sun visor and the roof. But at that point, if a stationary contact, we should see a stationary pattern. But sun visor under the roof shows her head was moving back and forth and struggling because the hair swipe shows us somebody was pinned against that area, meanwhile struggle.
At trial, the blood swipes weren't the only thing Ken Matheson had trouble explaining. A metal nut encrusted with blood and hair that Henry Lee found in the front of the van provided a mirror impression of the wound on his wife's skull.
What that indicated was that the struggle had taken place, that Yvonne had been beaten, had been severely bleeding. Then the body was brought out into this wet, muddy environment along the side of the road.
Ken Matheson finished his wife off on the rainy roadway by running her over and then returned her muddy body to the back of the van. This scenario was consistent with something else Dr. Lee found. Most of the blood in the back of the van was not diluted by water. That told him Yvonne Matheson was bleeding inside the van before she was dragged into the rainy night.
When I asked him whether his wife's body was dry or wet when he took her inside the van, he answered, "I don't know." Now, he had to answer, "I don't know," because he was painted into a corner by the forensic evidence. If he testified that his wife was dry, he would be a transparent liar to the jury.
Investigators still weren't sure what the murder weapon was. Dr. Lee found a clue in a clump of 20 severed hairs in the van's door.
This portion of hair smashed and broken, which means a blunt force hit this surface. This force cut the hair open, also damaged the cuticle, the hair fibers and everything, so flattened it out. Based on this, we know if something has to be sufficient force. Could be a police issue flashlight or a metal pipe.
But the most chilling piece of forensic evidence that Henry Lee found was barely visible to the human eye.
When we examined the van, I noticed there's some pattern here. This pattern is so unclear, that's why we have to enhance it.
Correct.
So
This clear liquid will go onto the stain, and the presence of the blood will catalyze this reaction in almost instantaneous. You'll get a color transformation of the trace amounts of the blood. Very, very sensitive. It takes very little blood in order for this reagent to react.
well, after spray, you can see the pattern all show up. A hand coming downwards, a fist come this way, additional blood drop we notice in this area.
It was Yvonne Matheson's last attempt to escape what she had feared was inevitable, a fatal beating that started in the front of the van.
Tried to hit her The blood spatter start producing this area. She tried to get up, cause this hair transfer, got hit again. She was moving towards back of the van. Sergeant Matheson followed her a couple more times. She struggled to this location, and additional assault, she gone to this area. That shows us the last moment of Yvonne's life. That's a silent voice from Yvonne. Tried to cry out, to talk to the forensic scientist, what did happen here? It's not run over the park by the car. She was attacked inside the van. Her last moment of life against the side of the van, either trying to get out of the van or crying for help, finally sliding down and on the floor.
It took the jury less than 3 hours to convict Ken Matheson of murder and kidnapping. He was sentenced to life in prison.
If somebody committed the murder, we will find those silent clues, the trace evidence. With those trace evidence, the prosecutor can prove or disprove the case.
Back in his home state of Connecticut, Dr. Henry Lee is once again called to help solve a particularly puzzling murder.
I'm start driving middle of the night, asking myself, what am I doing here? A normal person, they work 9 to 5. They go home, have a beer, watch TV. And middle of the night, I'm driving to respond to a scene. When I was a police officer, we have a day shift, night shift, graveyard shift. But I don't have a second shift person to cover. I don't have a third shift person to cover. I'm the second shift. I'm the third shift. I'm the only shift.
One of Dr. Lee's graveyard shifts began in the affluent suburb of Easton, Connecticut. The tiny town of 7,000 is horse and farm country in commuting distance of New York City. It was here in Easton that John and Eileen Hupplinger spent years designing their dream house on 3 secluded acres and a private lake they shared with neighbors. One of those neighbors was Andrea Altieri, who could see the Hupplinger estate across the water from her kitchen window.
On the night of May 6th, I was here painting, and I had gone over to the sink several times to get fresh water, and I noticed the lights were on.
She knew John and Eileen were early risers and that their home was usually dark by 10 p.m. John Hupplinger was 35 and an executive with a large engineering firm. He drove an early carpool to work while Eileen stayed home with their 2 young children.
And when I went to bed, I said to my husband, I hope no one's sick over at the Hupplingers' house. I said, because the light's been going on and off.
It was just beginning to warm up enough to open windows in the sprawling homes around the neighborhood's private lake. No one here worried much about crime. But at 4:55 in the morning, the Easton police dispatcher received a call from a nearly hysterical man.
This is John Hupplinger. My wife is in serious shape.
Tell me what's wrong.
God, she's bloody.
She's bloody?
Oh, God, her whole face, her head.
All right, I'll send an officer immediately.
I'll leave the lights on in the driveway.
Officer Ray Osborne was a rookie cop on the Easton police force.
I pulled in the driveway. I started walking towards the doorway, and he ran towards me. And I subsequently found out that was Mr. Hupplinger. He was borderline crying, very upset, saying that she's all bloody, she's all bloody.
John Hupplinger led the young police officer into the house where his wife lay on a blood-soaked sofa in the family room. This is the actual crime scene video taken by the first officers who arrived.
This woman had obviously suffered a massive head wound, and I was just trying to put 2 and 2 together. It was hard to keep control, but, you know, I tried to keep my head about me. He told me that he had 2 children upstairs, and that immediately concerned me because I had one victim that was obviously dead, and I suspected that she had been murdered.
The police officers checked upstairs and found the 2 small Hupplinger children still sleeping. They carried them to the neighbors and began to search the Hupplinger property.
He said, I don't know what happened to my wife. She wasn't in the bed with me, and I went to look for her, and this is how I found her.
Hupplinger said that there had been recent break-ins in the neighborhood and dictated a 16-page statement to the police chief about what had happened.
I found Eileen off the driveway. I brought her up out of the woods. I said, "Oh my Lord, sweet God." I carried her back to the house. I put her on the couch in the family room. I tried to clean up the blood on the floor. I was worried about the kids getting up and seeing the blood.
The concerns was the blood inside the house, the concentration of blood along the driveway, on both sides of the driveway. They were unable to determine what they were from. All of us trained investigators, I think, were really having a difficult time evaluating that evidence.
Light was just breaking, and the bloody trail that baffled detectives was now clearly visible on the winding gravel driveway.
They tell me middle of the night, can't find his wife. So he got up, started looking for her.
When Dr. Lee showed up the next day to analyze the crime scene, he could understand the detective's confusion. The bloodstains on the driveway told him a different story than the version of events Hupplinger had told the police. Dr. Lee saw separate trails, sometimes parallel, sometimes intersecting. As a forensic scientist, he followed his instincts and the new paths he'd uncovered.
We start checking the trap rod, inch by inch, look at the pattern.
Using the same methods they'd used to reconstruct the original blood trail, Dr. Lee and Timothy Palmbach, the current head of the Connecticut State Crime Lab, mapped the movement of the body on the driveway.
We follow the blood dripping. This trail leading to a place about 25 feet from the house. We see an accumulation of the blood stain in this location. That's the area we notice this hesitation mark.
Dr. Lee marked the area where he had first observed a large pool of blood. The size of the blood drops and the amount indicated to him that Eileen's killer stopped here for a while and that her bleeding body was shifted closer to the ground.
He then went literally drop by drop, drag by drag down the driveway. And as he saw a pattern change, he'd mark it. And he realized that what he really had wasn't one or two, but it was actually 3 separate trails.
The first trail of blood dripping into the wood, then the second trail coming out of the wood. We use a yellow thread to show that the yellow string leading us from the wood come to this location, become a smear. It's no longer dripping anymore.
The smear told Dr. Lee that the body was dragged and moved in an unexpected direction, to a point even further down the driveway.
To this location, another point of hesitation. It looks like he tried to make a decision, should put the body this side or that side.
For some strange reason, the trail then traveled deeper into the woods.
Follow this yellow thread into the wood. Later we found large pool of blood caked with some hair tissue-like material. However, the blood pattern shows us she was dragged into the wood and subsequently carried out.
The colored strings painted an alarming picture to Dr. Lee. John Hupplinger did carry his wife into their house. But what about the other trails that showed Eileen Hupplinger was moved out of the house towards the woods? Why was the victim dragged around the driveway, and by whom? Police were called to the wealthy community of Easton, Connecticut by John Hupplinger. He told police he woke up in the middle of the night and discovered his wife was missing. He said he found her dead in the woods near his house and that he carried her back inside. But Dr. Lee discovered 2 trails, one which went into the house and another going away from it.
This is just like a history book. Tell us what did happen that night. When we walk into living room, everything's quiet. The whole air looks like frozen. Only on the sofa have a large pool of blood, which consistent with Mr. Hupplinger's statement, he carried her body back.
But the amount of the blood on the cushions indicated to Dr. Lee that Mrs. Hupplinger was killed here while lying on the sofa. The medical examiner later confirmed that Eileen died from strangulation and deep cranial trauma as a result of being hit on the head with a blunt object, which resulted in massive bleeding. Detectives began to search for a weapon and speculated that a missing golf club might be the blunt object that inflicted the deadly wounds.
I thought the murder weapon was a 7-iron, and I thought that because in the basement there was a full set of golf clubs with everything there but a 7-iron. I called the divers because when I saw the golf clubs downstairs.
The state police thought the killer might have ditched the 7-iron in the private lake behind the house.
One missing. And there was one missing. It was so odd that one should be missing.
You remember I tried to throw the golf club?
Divers came up empty-handed.
I'm not a golfer. This pattern is inconsistent with a golf club. And also the injury. Give me a square corner.
Dr. Lee told detectives to stop looking for the 7-iron. He suggested they search for a small, heavy object, perhaps a brick from the driveway or one from the newly built wishing well.
Water was very, very clear right at the edge, and there was some blood on the rocks near, a very small amount of blood on the rocks was a brick.
This is the place we found the murder weapon. It's not a golf club.
Detectives collected the brick and other evidence and brought them to Dr. Lee's lab for microscopic examination of the trace transfers on the surface.
These portions of brick have a direct contact with a human head.
The ability of that brick to create that level and that depth of a head injury and skull fracture, it was at least medically consistent that that brick could have been the murder weapon or the blunt trauma instrument.
In the lab, the brick yielded more clues. Algae present in the pond, as well as hair fragments that may have come from Eileen Hupplinger. Dr. Lee knew that a brick of that weight used as a murder weapon could easily have created the blood cast-off found on the drapes, walls, and window.
I'm pulling some blood to represent a bloody surface. Then I use this brick. Right. The cast-off is on the back. That represents a kitchen cabinet. I noticed the coffee table on the side of the table have about 50 individual blood drops. Those are pretty small, about 1 to 2 millimeter in size, all grouped together. That cast-off pattern shows it's a backhand. From the front and back hit the surface of the kitchen cabinet. But those cast-off patterns just cannot be explained by carrying a body. That's a big puzzle to me.
The animation illustrates Dr. Lee's theory. Did a brick produce the blood cast-off around the victim's body? If the killer approached the sofa and hit the victim 3 to 4 times with a brick, the animation clearly shows that the blood would travel in the direction Dr. Lee surmised, to the coffee table, walls, and drapes. But the puzzle was still incomplete. Who killed Eileen Hupplinger? The missing pieces started to emerge when family and neighbors began to tell investigators a less idyllic tale of the young couple with the beautiful home.
She would knock on my door and she was locked out. I would make her a cup of tea and that's when she would confide in me. She would say to me, "Oh, I don't think I'm being abused. He doesn't hit me, but he shakes me and shoves me," and I wanted to shake her myself and say that's abuse.
They had been having problems for a long time, even before they were married. She was always making excuses. He was a very, very good-looking fellow, and he was very, very charming. You know, sort of like the street angel and the house devil.
In John Hupplinger's statement to police, he admitted having problems with his wife, that she had, quote, certain behavior traits he took exception to. Investigators now believe that Hupplinger's marital problems had taken an ominous turn.
We were able to establish that as recently as a matter of days, she had contacted her lawyer to file divorce papers and had spoken to her cousin to tell her that she was going to tell her husband she was going to get a divorce.
A troubled marriage and a tangled trail. Would that be enough to make a case against John Hupplinger for the murder of his wife? News of Eileen Hupplinger's death spread quickly in the small town of Easton. The trace evidence was pointing to her husband, but investigators still needed something more to connect the young executive to his wife's murder. Catching up over coffee, Dr. Lee and prosecutor Frank Mako reviewed the complex forensic evidence discovered at the scene that pointed to John Hupplinger.
But the reconstruction showed a story inconsistent with his statement.
Doesn't kill and drag to two places. He doesn't go dispose of the brick down at the pond.
Then we found blood spatter, cast off pattern on the window. Yeah. He's a smart man. He was smart. Yeah, but he made the mistake.
John Hupplinger's story had started to fall apart, but there was still something missing. They found it when Dr. Lee examined some clothing left to dry on the back deck.
When we look at back to the house on the railing, see a t-shirt hung over the railing. The t-shirt have a washed pattern. It's diluted blood with some green algae-like material adhere on the surface.
The wet t-shirt was taken to the lab for microscopic examination. Dr. Lee found bloodstains that had been diluted in water containing a specific type of algae, the same kind of algae present in the Hupplinger pond.
Material. Clearly, those individual cells linked together. The algae from the brick.
Dr. Lee had made a key discovery. The algae from the t-shirt was the same as the algae found on the brick. He concluded that whoever was wearing the t-shirt was probably the same person who placed the brick in the pond. Investigators soon discovered that the t-shirt matched the one John Hupplinger was wearing, the same size and make as those found in his bedroom bureau.
The evidence we had, the forensic evidence, which I indicated to you, was the obtaining of the blood evidence driveway, family room, area of the pond, clothing of Mr. Hupplinger. The blood evidence upstairs in the children's rooms, in the area where the children were, just highlighted the state's position that this is not the way an intruder acts.
For the Easton police, there were too many holes in John Hupplinger's story that someone else had killed his wife. They believed they had motive, opportunity, and enough forensic evidence to charge Hupplinger with the murder. But without eyewitnesses, the case would rely on the evidence developed by Dr. Lee.
I can't point in any particular direction. It wouldn't make any sense for an intruder or anyone else who had killed her there to carry her outside. It didn't make any sense for John to have done that. But they set up a straw man there by saying that we claimed it was an intruder. I didn't claim it was an intruder. I didn't know what had happened.
But Henry Lee and his forensic team believed they knew exactly what happened that night. The inconsistencies of Hupplinger's statement began right at his front door.
We see in this photograph at the Hupplinger residence a low-velocity drip pattern in the front foyer, and then there's an accumulation of these droplets right here. What this is consistent with is that Mr. Hupplinger, as he's carrying his bleeding wife, stopped there at the doorway to reach out with his hand and open it. Now, if Mr. Hupplinger's story was true, and that he had picked up her dying body and brought it into the house, what we should have seen is this same accumulation pattern here inside the foyer, outside on the brick here.
Outside, the mysterious intersecting blood trails told the true story of how Eileen Hupplinger's body was moved.
Look at this blood trail. Let's try to reenact, to reconstruct what did happen that night. He carried her out of the house along this driveway.
Using one of his graduate students with approximately the same size and weight as the victim, Dr. Lee demonstrated what he believed happened on the driveway that night.
All right?
Okay. And we'll follow you.
We see a accumulation of the blood drop, which looks like you try to move this side a little bit, then turn around, move to that side, and head position has to be off the shoulder because the head wound, the blood coming along the hair, dripping on the ground. Now, at this point, we see an accumulation of blood.
A pooling.
the police stopped here, get the body, wondering what I'm going to do with her. That's why we see hesitation, moving along this way towards the wood a little bit, then change his mind, then try to move towards the pond.
Dr. Lee's systematic charting of the blood-stained driveway showed the trail led away from the house and into the woods. And the trace evidence discovered on Eileen's clothing and the abrasion marks on her back confirmed she had been dragged by her feet on a gravel surface. But it was some common garden plants that gave up the final clues.
All the clover leaves bent to one direction, away from the house. That's a clear indication the body was moved from inside the house and goes out.
And finally,
it appeared to be her body was dragged into the packing syndrome. All those leaves and the vegetation bended into one direction. That's why the blood drops was deposited on the top of the surface, left the blood smear on one side of the packing syndrome. That shows us how that exactly happened.
Her lifeless body was dragged. The hair, the head touched the driveway, keep left behind. The trace evidence for us to read, for us to study.
The forensic facts detailed by Henry Lee convinced two juries that John Hupplinger killed his wife. His first conviction was overturned on a legal technicality, but he was retried and again convicted. He died in prison while playing basketball.
Being at a crime scene with Henry is an education in itself. He's mysterious. He makes you think. He sees things that the police officer doesn't see.
My responsibility as a investigator is to recover individual scientific fact, to put together, then present the fact to the court of law, to the judge, to the jury. It's district attorney's responsibility to introduce the motive, the scientific fact, and to link to somebody.